Moving quickly along, because I know there's going to be questions for everyone, with a brief point about Representative McClintock's speech, which was, I thought it was it's really great in studying these things to hear a congressman talk about the Constitution, and also to hear a congressman talk about Congress itself as having a role and taking some pride in the institution and so on. So, Congressman, is very Madisonian of you today, and I can give no higher praise to anyone. And that's what James Madison wanted, and that's why the Constitution's the way it is. And I think one thing that hasn't been said today is what were they trying to do in Philadelphia in 1787? They didn't like war. They feared war. One person at the convention said we should make it hard to get into wars and easy to get out of them, right? They were not at all bloodthirsty or desiring, although they recognized the need for national defense and so on. And so that's what they were trying to do. And what they wanted is not an absolute bar on the ability to use national defense or the military to defend the country. They wanted some collaboration. They wanted some public discussion. They wanted public debate. They wanted, to put it in one word that they would have used, they wanted to live in a republic and to have Republican values. They wanted to force some discussion about this, to make the president come to Congress and get some authorization, so you just don't have one person exercising their alleged prerogatives, because they had already lived through that, as the congressman said. That was the English king. And that's what we're about today, and that's how serious this is. I want to focus on one issue and one issue only, and a little bit of history, and suggest why it's important very quickly. I was struck, as I know perhaps many of you were, when you read President Obama's letter that he sent on the Monday after the Saturday beginning of the battle in Libya. His letter essentially announcing what had happened. It begins by saying, I ordered military operations, and then he gives the time and where and so on. But immediately thereafter, when you're expecting sort of, why are you doing this? What is the point? Two things are mentioned. One is the United Nations authorization and some other multinational authorizations, and also the humanitarian rationale for it. Well, that's pretty striking to me, I thought, that the president, in his own mind, it seemed, that the rationale and the authorization for this undertaking came from the United Nations. And it also, at the same time, in the speech, he had taken on a universal jurisdiction, as it were, of protecting foreign nationals, and as he said in his speech later, throughout the world. And what went with it was a kind of authorization that came from a world body. Well, I thought, this is very odd that the president would do something like this, refer to somebody outside the Constitution, outside the United States. So I started looking about this, and it turns out that it is a bit odd, and I want to just talk briefly about that and then suggest what needs to be done. The most likely and most clear-cut example in the past of this happening is, in fact, in the post-World War II period and the first war of that period, the war in Korea. You may recall that the war in Korea began with an invasion of the South. It required quick action and got quick action from President Truman. He never sought, however, it did have a United Nations authorization for defending South Korea, largely because the Soviets were boycotting the Security Council at the time. President Truman never sought authorization from Congress. So, in fact, he ended up fighting the Korean War solely on the basis of two things. One was the United Nations resolution, and second was the fact that he refused to call it a war. Thousands of American lives ultimately lost there, and untold treasure and so on. But it was called a police action under the United Nations, and therefore he undertook it in his role purely as commander-in-chief. That is, the commander-in-chief powers were enough for it. The war itself became, we don't remember now so much, became very unpopular, and the president paid a tremendous political price for it. But notice, when people talk about it this way, this is completely wrong. The Constitution does not say that there's some kind of after-the-fact punishment or reward for having wars. The Constitution has a process that is ex ante. It's before things happen. Congress is supposed to be consulted. We don't have wars and then find out on election day if it was a good idea or not. not? Because you're going to hear arguments about that. Well, the president doesn't have total discretion because ultimately he has to face the voters. But that's not the constitutional process that we have. The other examples that are close to this, this kind of use of the United Nations for armed attacks and use of force, would be the Kosovo example. Now, in 1991, in the Persian Gulf War, the Bush administration did claim under a United Nations resolution that they had the power to do it alone, but they did not do it and did not try to undertake the war on that basis. They actually went and got congressional authorization. In Kosovo in 98 and 99, President Clinton ultimately said that he had the power to conduct the bombing campaign in Kosovo, that it was a presidential power, and this is a little bit different and quite different from the current situation. He claimed that the ability came and he was transferring the authority to NATO. So ultimately, it wasn't just the United Nations, it was a multinational treaty organization, which goes with all the problems of constitutionality, which is you can't have a treaty arrangement, the Senate and the President amending the Constitution. It doesn't work like that, or it's kind of pointless to have a written Constitution. Now, so what else can we be said about this? Well, the question is, so we are in a very interesting and not quite unique but important situation, which is this. This is only the second time, I sense, that we have a president claiming solely on the basis of a UN resolution that he can use force abroad. Now, the issue is this, though, in two ways. If it's the second time, there will not be only the second time. There'll be a third and fourth time. The concern I have here is that with the Constitution the way it is, often the defenders of presidential prerogatives, and we've heard this argument from Jack Goldsmith and others this time, that, you know, the Constitution's kind of ambiguous, but the presidents have been doing this, and since they've been doing it and Congress doesn't say anything about it, well, let's just assume the Constitution's been amended, because it's been amended in practice, really, because Congress didn't show any desire to push back, right? So if this just goes down the pike and nobody says anything, there are no votes in Congress, there is no attempt to defund or anything, there are going to be more wars like this, and we're going to essentially see a transfer of the authorization in practice, if not in theory, of war making from the United States to some multinational body or the United Nations Security Council. So what needs to be done? In the past, Congress has at least one chamber or the other has tried to defund or has in fact done so or put limitations on funding. What we need is some pushback from Congress in some way that is a serious political gesture, or, of course, ideally, Congress would use its powers to, that Madison, to finish with where I began, that Madison thought, and sadly had great confidence in, it didn't turn out to be true, that the power to control appropriations would be the power ultimately that Congress would exercise over the executives. Thank you.